Hey everyone, I hope this video finds you well, and I hope you're all geared up for some more spooky stories. The video after this might be about alien abductions. I don't know yet. I'm working on one though, so it'll be out when it's out, I suppose. Anyways, I hope that you can once again, pull up a stump with me, and we can listen to some pretty spooky stories that I had found. So let's get into it. And just before I get into this story, I want to be completely transparent with everybody. There will be ads in this video. They're going to be at specific points so as not to interrupt me when I'm talking, because that had been a problem before in some of the videos. They were putting them in weird spots. So I figured out how to do it myself, so I'm going to put them in different spots along the video. So that's just to be open with you all. So yeah, this is the first story now. I was 7 or 8 years old and I had a really bad fever. My parents didn't really know what to do, so we ended up calling 999. They said to put me in a bathtub full of water that's like pretty cold. So my parents do it, and I just remember being super cold, and then all of a sudden it's like I was burning hot, and I instantly go unconscious. There's this weird pop somewhere in the middle of my brain. I open my eyes, and I'm floating 2 feet above my body looking at the ceiling. But it's not the ceiling anymore. It's kind of hard to describe. I'm looking at some kind of desert. Looks almost like pictures of Mars. Really bleak, and it seems to go on forever. And then there's a click and an explosion a little ways away. I watch the smoke and fire for what feels like hours, and then I feel another pop, and I'm back in my body. My parents take me to the A&E, and I end up having a super bad case of the flu. So years later, we fast forward, I'm in Afghanistan, and we're out in the middle of nowhere. The Humvee is keeping to a pre-designated path to try and avoid IEDs. And we're just in some random spot in the desert, and all of a sudden I get this absolutely terrible feeling. I tell the driver to stop. He does, and he asks what's wrong. I tell him there's a bomb up ahead, so they go and they check it out, and sure enough, there's signs of a fresh dig. It's enough that it would have vaporized us. Remember the night in the bathtub, and I have absolutely no explanation for this at all. So what do you think? Was that story real, or is it fiction? You can let me know in the comments. Although I will say that when I was really young, I had a dream that I was driving in a blue car, and I had done something. I got into a bad accident and I died. So, fast forward to 2018, I had gotten my first car, and it was a blue, but I had not really thought of the dream too much. And I was driving home one night after watching a horror movie at a midnight showing, and I live an hour away from the nearest movie theater, so I was kind of driving through the woods and stuff. And I was coming in a turn, and I was driving kind of fast, but I wasn't speeding too much. I was just kind of driving fast. And I got the memory of the dream, and there was something in my head that told me to swerve, and it was just screaming at me. So after I kind of looked forward, trying to focus, a moose ran out in front of me. I ran a turn, so I swerved to the left, and I hit the moose on the passenger side, and I ended up totally wrecking my car. And if you need proof, I might put a picture of the car in the video here. But yeah, and I could have died in that car accident. It's kind of a surreal thing that I had a dream about that when I was a kid. And then, since I almost knew it was going to happen, I avoided it. It's odd. Anyways, we'll get on to the next story now. This story is supposedly from a guy who is ex-military, and a guy that the storyteller knows from the pub. My friend is a pilot, and he was flying up in the Northern Territory. He radios into this airstrip because he knows the couple that run it. He says he'll be there in 4 hours or so, and will radio when he's near the airstrip. So he gets close to the airstrip hours later that the couple run, and there's no reply. So he circles around and tries again, and there's still no reply. He goes to an airstrip in the next town over, tells the guys working there that the couple never picked up the radio. They call the police. The police come around and they all travel to the airstrip that the couple own. Get there about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. The lights in the house are off, but the spotlights are on, and some were shining off into the hills. They walk around the side of the house where the dogs are kept, and they notice 2 things right away. The dogs are dead, but there was no sign of physical harm on them, and they all had these awful looks of terror on their face, and it appears they were literally scared to death. The second thing was the side of the house was riddled with bullet holes, but they were fired from the inside, going out. They go in the house and find the couple dead on the ground, with the man's AR-15 in his hand. They had the same look of fear and shock on their faces as the dogs, and they were said to have died in the same way. The police radio it in, and it's not until dawn when the other police and paramedics show up, and there's some people from the Air Force there too. They saw them talking to the police and then came over to the locals and told them to get out of there and don't tell anybody what they may have heard or saw. The guy who told me the story was in the U.S. Air Force and was involved with the Project Blue Book and other UFO-related business. Strange lights and other events had went down in the area the same night of the incident. So what do you think about that story? Again, real or fake? Let me know what you think. So I was 19, and I was alone in my own house. The house is a Grade 2 listed building in England, and is at least 500 years old. My cat and my Labrador are keeping me company in the living room. It gets to around midnight, and I start hearing foxes out in the garden, scratching and screaming at each other. And if you didn't know, fox screams are pretty, there's something, we'll put it like that. So the foxes are out doing their thing as usual, then all of a sudden they stop. The cat and the Labrador raise their heads and go look out the garden window. The lab is growling, and the cat just stares. Something is scratching at the front door. It stops scratching, and it actually knocks a couple times. I hear the letterbox being opened, something being pushed through it. I shut the room door and I bolt out of there. The thing outside starts growling. There's weird lights at the window. I hear it rubbing up at the house walls, so I close the curtains and I close the blinds, turn off the room lights, turn on the indoor lights. I see the outline. I basically messed my pants right there. I immediately messaged my friend on Facebook and called the police. Hey, there's a monster in my garden. Please send help. My lab was going crazy at this point, whining and burying his face in the sofa. The cat is on my lap, under the dressing gown. The thing outside seems to be quadruped and is about the size of my car. The neighbor yells out to shut up, and it presumably sees it. And then he kinda goes back in his house and he calls the police, I assume. Apparently the police don't ignore 2 separate prank calls. A police car shows up and the officer sees the thing in the driveway. The thing in the driveway sees the officer, and the thing jumps over the hedge, and then my friend pulls up and eventually runs to the door. The officer screaming for backup. I can hear him and how terrified he is. I go to open the living room door to let my friend in, and what I see that was pushed through the letterbox was the entrails of a fox lying on the floor. I shudder, but I open the door for my friend, and I spend the rest of the night telling the terrified officer that he's a good man and that I like him, while the officer struggles to calm down. Unmarked vehicles show up hours later, and they fix damages to wall and porch roof. They clean up the inside, and the officer had found that I was in possession of drugs, so he looked over the possession charge in exchange for silence. And I obviously said sure. So what do you think about that story? Was it real, or was it apparently just a drug trip? Or was something going on, but was the guy high and he made it out to be something it wasn't? You tell me what you think. Now, I had a very good friend, and I'll call him Sherlock, because he believed in very much similar philosophies to him, as in deductive reasoning and the purity of a priori logic. I've heard him over the radio when he's being shot at and having RPGs fired at him, and he sounded as calm and relaxed as somebody who was on a holiday at an ice cream shop, and his only care was specifying what flavor they wanted. For example, Cucumber Crisp 071. I'm under fairly heavy sustained fire. It looks like part of my fuselage just gave way. Over. That sort of thing. I'm fairly sure that he had something wrong with him, because he would just wait until base told him to pull out or whatever. He also had no mercy. If he had authorization to fire, he'd just fire. No qualms, no limitations. Anyway, I've seen Sherlock quake like a leaf in the winter wind. It must have been around 3 a.m. and there was nothing at all to do. I was playing poker against the computer and winning every time. Another friend of mine reading Kant on my bed, when Sherlock walked into my room. Pretty unusual, because he always knocked. He delivered some supplies to an outpost that was 70 kilometers away from the base. This wasn't in deep hostile territory, but it was hostile enough that you'd expect an RPG or two when you were on a supply run, or took out the wounded, which was mainly what Sherlock did, and even volunteering to do it. He'd sat down in the afternoon and helped unload the supplies, mainly medical supplies. There was ammunition and tools, and even stuck around taking requests from the CO, who was running low on water and water purification tablets. A few privates were on duty in the dusk, and one of them freaked out, saying he could see something through the thermals that he couldn't see in person. This piqued Sherlock's curiosity, so he had a look. Sure enough, when he looked through the thermals, he could see the shapes of a man, about 200 meters down the path, but looking with binoculars, he couldn't see anything. Even with night vision, there was just nothing. This is quite common in Afghanistan, but it's reported very uncommonly, and you can probably guess why. And it's obviously always quite unnerving when this happens, but according to Sherlock, he wasn't really fazed, just his deductive reasoning pricking up. First he thought the thermals were just dodgy, so he used another set, and then another set, and he thought that the binoculars might have been bad, so he used another pair, which weren't thermal imaging, but infrared night vision. Rather than the green-tinted type, it was a grayscale type, which showed significant detail. Now, on the infrared grayscale, he could see it. Apparently it was a human and everything other than having a head. The body was human, perfectly proportioned, but there was just no head. Now the other night vision didn't show anything. Sherlock, armed with nothing other than a standard issue of Browning High Power, and probably just a single magazine, strolled 200 meters down the path to see if he could see anything. Apparently not, though he said he felt unusually chilly, and he did feel quite uneasy. It was on his way back when he heard soldiers shouting. Looking behind him, he saw 4 or 5 petrified bodies shambling after him. He described the smell as absolutely rancid, and their look as if they had contracted the vilest form of leprosy. They were moving pretty quickly, and he could see body parts, fingers, hands, and an entire arm drop off. When he said that they were like the Walking Dead, I felt a chill go up my spine, and my friend reading Kant actually looked up at us and stopped reading. Sherlock said he had shouted a warning to the bodies, apparently rotting as if dead for a few days, appendages and torso swollen from the sun, and as they continued to gain ground on him, he began opening fire. Despite one of them being hit several times, losing most of its shoulder, and through the stomach, it single-mindedly continued pursuing Sherlock, who for the first time ever sprinted away. A rifleman at the outpost shot them with a more high-powered weapon and, quotes, killed, maybe re-killed, one of them. As soon as one of them went lifeless, the others would single-mindedly stuff their faces full of flesh, just tearing off limbs and bodies. No shame, no disgust, like they hadn't eaten for days. At this point, the fellow reading Kant piped up. He'd heard similar stories in his journeys to outposts. Some American soldiers were badly injured and delirious in the sun, told him how they had seen their brothers in arms set upon by these filthy people, beings, whatever they were, and ripped apart alive, limbs ripped from bodies, heads from necks, and how they would rip the flesh off with their long nailed fingers, gouging it out, or sometimes they'd bite it off the bones. They said that only fire or high-velocity weapons, not small arms, could drop them. Afghan soldiers, when mortally wounded, prefer to kill themselves than be captured, because they too have heard stories and know the folklore. I must also admit, as I became more experienced and hardened to the oddness of Afghanistan, I also heard quite a few of these stories myself, to the point where I don't even really worry anymore. I think one time I even saw a, quote, herd of them rampage through a village, but it's Afghanistan, so it could have just been people tripping on opiates. Now, what do you think about that one? Now, usually when I would hear stories about, like, real-life zombies, I would kind of just say, okay, it's probably somebody tripping, probably, like in the story, someone tripping on opiates. People could be just delirious. Like, there's any number of explanations, but I've heard actually quite a few stories from Afghanistan, Iraq, and generally the Middle East. I've also seen some pretty weird videos that I can't really discount right off. If I ever find them again, because it was on some pretty shady places on the internet, but if I ever find them again, I might, try to slip them into a video on here, or do something with them. But yeah, what do you think happened? Do you think it's real, or do you think it's fake? Let me know what you think. This last story is a little on the weird side, I'll put it that way, so strap in. So my parents were big outdoor buffs. My father was an ex-champion boat racer, and my mom was an Alabama-raised country girl, so they always wanted to go camping and sailing and fishing and do all that stuff when I was little. They went on a trip with some of their friends, and when I was about 10, which would be 16 years ago, and since then they refused to go camping anymore, ever. My dad told me the story sometime after I turned 18. It still makes me wonder, considering the following. My parents moved a lot and only had one set of friends that they really kept in touch with at all times, Danny and Lisa. Danny and Lisa weren't really outdoor nuts like my parents were, but they were friends, and it's fun to camp with your friends, right? So they all planned like a 5-day trip to the lake, which was south of where we lived, with a creek that was on Danny's father's property, so they could camp out on that property and fish all they wanted, and then go to the lakes with ease. And everything in the story after this is from the account of the father, so just to clear that up. The first 2 days were quite normal, just camping, drinking, sharing stories while fishing and boating and water skiing. It was pretty much heaven. It was just young adults / parents having fun. The second night, everyone kept hearing these weird yelps and barks, like 2 dogs were in a fight, but they were both hurt and just yelping the whole time. So they figured it was coyotes, and they slept. The next day, they continued on their adventures. That night, they kept hearing these noises, but they were extremely close to the camp, so my father and Danny went out to see if they could scare them off, while my mom and Lisa stayed behind, scared out of their minds, hiding in a tent. Probably reading the Bible or something. Anyways, my dad and Danny went out to look for these fighting coyotes, searching by following the sound. My dad had a shotgun, and Danny had a machete. They were hoping to scare the coyotes or whatever with a gunshot. They got to a clearing and they could hear the noise extremely loud, but it seemed to be from multiple directions, as if the sounds were kind of distant from each other. Now, my dad is a bit of a kook, swears he saw Bigfoot when he was 14, but this is different. He just told Danny to go back. No questions, no explanation, just, Danny, we need to go back. So they did, but the sounds didn't fade away this time. Danny nervously asked my dad what was going on, but my dad wouldn't tell him. He just kept shushing him. Danny's a bit of a goofball, hence why I always liked my Uncle Danny quotes. So he thought my dad was getting him back for a prank. He kept nudging my dad, trying to get him to say, gotcha, but my dad never untensed. Finally, they got close to the creek, a ways up from the camp, and my dad told Danny to run, fast, like sprint. Then my dad took off, no remorse. Danny apparently followed, but tripped and called for my dad, but my dad, who tears up and sputters at this part, as also uncharacteristic of him, refused to go back for him, even though Danny started calling for help. Danny was yelling that his leg was broken. It hurt. But my dad just kept running. Then, my dad, my mom, and Lisa, I'll say they heard what sounded like a really, really, really loud cougar growl. Imagine 2 lionesses going at it, amplified by 70 Marshall full stacks. That's how loud they were, and it said that it made my dad's ears ring. After that, Danny stopped screaming for help. My dad got back to camp, and the ladies asked what the hell was going on. But my dad just said something was out there. My mom, being practical woman she is, says, oh, no really, what was it? But my dad wouldn't answer. Lisa is freaking out, asking where Danny is, but my dad just keeps saying he'll be here in a second. A few hours pass by, and the ladies are extremely worried about Danny. My dad apparently would cringe when they said something. Eventually, from the opposite side that my dad arrived from, came Danny, walking up just fine to the camp. Wordlessly, my dad cocked his rifle, but waved it away as survival readiness, quotes. Something my mom says that she won't forget, because this is what tipped her off that something was very wrong. Danny first walked up and nudges his way next to my mother, but after the weird looks and death glare from my father, he moved closer to Lisa, who had been nagging him for 10 minutes, but he would either grunt yes or no, and he would just stare into the fire. My dad finally asked Danny what happened to his leg, and Danny looked up confused almost. My dad told him, I thought you said it was broken. Danny looked at him and replied, broken, and then as if on cue, started yelling, Steve, ow, my leg, I think it's broken. The ladies grabbed the med kits and first aid and water and were rationalizing as him going into shock, but upon getting his pants off with much difficulty as he refused to help them, and actually would make it harder for them to remove them. There was no obvious break, there was no blood, just bruises all up and down his side. Lisa kept asking him what happened, but he would grunt and wave her hands away from the business. My dad said, he's fine, let's just sleep. My mom gave him the are you kidding me look, and the look he gave her in return made her comply, as he never does that look, and they went into their tents. They said that they had heard Lisa nagging on one side arguing with Danny, because he would never reply when she'd ask him questions, and so she finally just says she's going to pee. Danny asked if he could come with her since there were animals out there, and not so many words, she said okay, and they left. My dad woke up around 10ish in the morning and started making breakfast. Danny and Lisa were gone. My mom asked where they were, but my dad wouldn't reply. After a little while they both came back, rather unceremoniously, and without a word. They weren't holding hands or in each other's arms, or even arm over the shoulder or anything like they always were. They were just kind of awkwardly standing next to each other. They refused food, and Danny would randomly yell out, my leg, as Lisa kept complaining of feeling ill. My mom suggested that they should go home and call off the whole trip on account of Danny's leg, who now was not limping at all, to my mom's horrified recollection, and the two nodded. My father just kind of watched. They all agreed, so Danny and Lisa got into my parents' car, not theirs, and just waited. Didn't pack up their tents, food, coolers, bags, or anything. My mom came over and asked if they were going to grab their things, and they shook their heads. My dad asked, why don't you take your car? And they both said, broken, just like Danny said last night, in a creepy, practiced way. My dad sighed and packed up the car, and they drove off. Danny and Lisa stayed quiet the whole way back, except their random mumblings with each other. Completely indecipherable. My parents took them home and came and got me, and we could tell that something was wrong. Besides them coming home days early, they said Danny got hurt, so they came home. And now, this part is like an aftermath thing from the storyteller's point of view about what he was asking his parents and stuff. I asked if we could go see them, but my dad replied no, a little too quickly, so I thought he was mad at me, so I left to go play PlayStation. I remember because I missed them and I thought he was mean, so I snuck back up the stairs and listened from the stairwell. I overheard my parents and grandparents talking about something wasn't right. It was just like those stories. I assumed they were talking about something random and got bored and went to go play more PlayStation. A few weeks later I asked about Uncle Danny, and my dad said that we're not going to go see them anymore. I was mad, so I demanded to know why. He told me something about his dad being sick, and I was pretty sad about it, so I just eventually forgot about it and life moved on. Fast forward about 5 years. I'm at a supermarket where I used to live when all this happened. It was also right by where Danny and Lisa lived, only on the other side of the road. Being 10, I was never allowed to go over, but now that I can drive, I decided to go see the old house, check out Danny and Lisa's house. I'm a pretty nostalgic person. So I drove down to see the old neighborhood, and I'm driving slowly, kind of rather creepishly down my old street, when I spot Danny walking down the street. So I'm really excited, and I flag him down. I pull over and I get to talk to him. He seemed a little stiff to me, kind of robotic I guess you could say when he hugged me, but it was way too tight. I felt like he was trying to smother me. I asked Danny how he'd been, and he said he's been okay. I asked him where Lisa was, and he said at home. So I asked if I could go see her, and he agreed. I walked with him, and I asked him about all kinds of people and tried to catch up, but he didn't seem to remember or care about 90% of it, which seemed odd because Danny was always my awesome involved Uncle Danny. So I asked him a couple obvious trick questions, and he failed miserably, and now I'm a little bit nervous. We get to his door and he opens it, and the smell of a rotten meat locker pours out. A horrid, incomparable smell just assaults my nostrils. The place is a wreck. There's stuff everywhere. Everything is coated in dust and nothing looks clean. Laundry is everywhere. There's no lights on, and it's just a mess. And I asked what happened here, and he just grunted a really weird, almost guttural grunt. So I asked after Lisa, and she yelled from the kitchen, and she was just behind a wall facing the room, but the wall wasn't a full wall, like with the top touching the ceiling, so I could smell something cooking. I walked into the kitchen expecting to see Lisa making some normal food, and planning on asking Lisa why Danny was acting weird, but what I saw was unforgettable. She's standing in the kitchen, and she's butt naked, covered in blood, cooking some kind of mangled mess, surrounded by thousands of bones. I was just smart enough to notice a pile of collars in the corner, like actual pet collars. I yelled and Danny lunged at me. I kinda sidestepped away from him and clumsily ran out the door. Danny gave chase and I got to the car and noped out as fast as I could. I got home, called the police and gave the address and went straight to my dad. He punched me in the face and told me he overheard the address. I tried to apologize and he just yelled at me, so I yelled at him for lying to me, so he hit me again, and then hugged me and said he was so sorry. I tried to ask him, but rather strongly told me to shut up about it and forget about it. The police came to my house and told me they didn't find anyone living there, but my story matched the description in place of an absolute nightmare. They told me they suspected the previous owners left, and a mixture of wild animals, burglar and homeless people had been living there. My dad, being the ridiculous genius he is, asked why the house hadn't been foreclosed or bill payments hadn't been an issue. The cops stammered and said they'd look into it. Apparently Danny's father had still been paying for it all, as per some agreement when they got married. I still haven't seen them since, and my dad only once told me the story beforehand. My meeting up with them was pure coincidence. and only made the story worse. A couple years after all that happened, me and my dad got very drunk together, and in his drunken stupor he told me the story and what happened to Danny. He knew what they were, but in my opinion, better Danny than my dad. So what'd you think of that story? It's a little odd, to say the least. I can't say for sure about whether that's real or not, but as always, I leave it up to you. So, do you think that something like this could happen? And if so, have you had any of your own weird experiences? I hope you enjoyed watching this video. I hope you enjoyed the stories, as off the wall as some of them are. And yeah, I just hope you enjoyed it. And if you liked the video, then you can like and subscribe. You can maybe donate to my Patreon that I'll put down in the comment. And I have a PayPal if you want to donate there. But yeah, so I hope you have a good night. And I hope you like and subscribe. And have a good weekend. Thank you for watching.